This is text marking for page 69 in your textbook, starting with race. Many people think of race as a series of biological classifications. However, research shows that that is not a meaningful way of differentiating people. Genetically, there are no systematic differences between the races that affect people's social behavior and abilities. Instead, sociologists use the term racial group to refer to those minorities and the corresponding dominant groups who are set apart from others by obvious physical differences. So I'm going to circle that because it is a vocabulary term that is defined within the text. But what is an obvious physical difference? Each society labels those differences that people consider important while ignoring other characteristics that could serve as a basis for social differentiation. So in that paragraph, I think to myself, what's the most important thing that is pointed out? That would be a main idea. And that is the fact that many people think of race as a series of biological classifications. However, it says research shows that that is not a meaningful way of differentiating people, and that there's no systematic differences between the races that affect people's social behaviors and abilities. So I'm going to highlight that as a main idea. And as a margin note for this, I'm going to comment on that is exactly true. Race means nothing. Okay, so that is going to be my margin note that I put over here. Okay, and then I'm going to keep reading. Social construction of race. Because race is a social construction, the process of defining races typically benefits those who have more power and privilege than others. In the United States, we see differences in both skin color and hair color, yet people learn informally that differences in skin color have a dramatic social and political meaning, whereas differences in hair color do not. So if I think about that paragraph, I can keep in mind that the main idea, the point that they're making, is that race is a social construction. The process of defining races typically benefits those who have more power and privilege than others. And so if you think about what we've talked about in the whole idea that race is a social construct, then I can make a note that race is indeed a social construct that was created throughout history. It contributes to racism and power and privilege and power. Okay, so that's my margin note that I'm going to have there. When observing skin color, many people in the United States tend to lump others rather casually into the traditional categories of black, white, and Asian. Subtle differences in skin color often go unnoticed. In many nations of Central America and South America, in contrast, people recognize color gradients on a continuum from light to dark skin color. Brazil has approximately 40 color groupings, while in other countries, people may be described as Mestizo Hondurans, Mulatto Colombians, or African Panamanians. What we see as obvious differences then are subject to each society's social definitions. The largest racial minorities in the United States are African Americans or Blacks, Native Americans or American Indians, and Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and other Asian peoples. Figure 10.1 provides, information about the population of racial and ethnic groups in the United States over the past 5 centuries, projected through 2060. Given current population patterns, it is clear that the nation's diversity will continue to increase. In 2011, for the first time ever, census data revealed that the majority of all children ages 3 and under are now either Hispanic or non-white. This turning point marked the beginning of a pattern in which the nation's minority population will slowly become the majority. By 2014, The majority people under age 18 in the United States belong to racial or ethnic minority groups. Racial definitions are crystallized through what Michael Ami and Howard Winant have called racial formation, a socio-historical process in which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. In this process, those who have power define groups of people according to a racist social structure. So I'm going to circle that because it is a vocabulary term that is defined in the text. And that also brings a main idea that those who have power define groups of people according to a racist social structure, and put a margin note there as well that says that this is the key. Again, it is socially constructed through history. Okay, so again, that race is that social construct. It's a social structure. It's not something that is biological again. So the creation of a reservation system for Native Americans in the late 1800s, which later influenced Charles Turnbull's life and work, is one example of racial formation. Federal officials combined what were distinctive tribes into a single racial group, which we refer today as Native Americans. The extent and frequency with which peoples are subject to racial formation is such that no one escapes it. Okay, and that is also something that we are going to highlight because it's basically saying that due to this social structure that was created, due to hierarchy of power, no one can escape the labeling that occurs in regards to racism, right? Once one is labeled a particular race, even though it's biological, historically, we are going to engage in racism. We are going to engage in power structure and power struggles. Okay, and then I'm going to bracket this as an example here because it provides an example of that occurring from Native Americans. Another example of racial formation from the 1800s was known as the one-drop rule. If a person had even a single drop of black blood, that person was defined and viewed as black, even if he or she appeared to be white. Clearly, race and social significance enough so that race had social significance enough so that white legislators established official standards about who was black and who was white. So another example appears here. The one-drop rule was a vivid example of the social construction of race. So we're going to circle this. The process by which people come to define a group of race based in part on physical characteristics, but also on historical, culture, and economic factors. So again, that social construct, right? It's how someone looks, right? But then that creates implications in regards to history, implications in regards to culture, and implications in regards to economics. So, for example, again, they're going to have an example to help you understand it better. In the 1800s, immigrant groups such as Italian and Irish Americans were not at first seen as being white, but as foreigners who were not necessarily trustworthy. The social construction of race is an ongoing process that is subject to debate. So that's the example here. is an ongoing process that is subject to debate, especially in a diverse society such as the United States, where each year increasing numbers of children are born to parents of different racial backgrounds. Recognition of multiple identities. In 1900, in an address to the Anti-Slavery Union in London, scholar W.E. Du Bois predicted that the color line would become the foremost problem of the 20th century. Du Bois, born a free black man in 1868, had witnessed prejudice and discrimination throughout the United States. His comment was prophetic. Today, over a century later, race and ethnicity still carry enormous weight in the United States. So I'm going to highlight that because that's an important detail from what he says, is that W.E. Du Bois predicted that the color line would become the foremost problem in the 20th century, and that today, over a century later, race and ethnicity still carry enormous weight in the United States. The color line has blurred significantly since 1900. However, interracial marriage is no longer forbidden by law and custom. Thus, Geetha Lakshmi Narayanan, a native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, is both white and Asian Indian. Often mistaken for a Filipino or Latina, she has grown accustomed to the blunt question, "What are you?" I'm going to put a margin note there that says, I have been taught before to never ask the question, "What are you?" or I guess it would be the questions then, or "Where are you from?" because they are considered judgmental questions. Okay. In the late 20th century, with immigration from Latin America rising, the fluid nature of racial formation became evident. Suddenly, people were speaking about the Latin Americanization of the United States, or about a biracial black-white society being replaced by a triracial one. In the 2010 census, over 9 million people in the United States, or about 2.9% of the population, reported that they were of two or more races. Half of the people classified as multiracial were under age 18, suggesting that this segment of the population will grow in the years to come. People who claimed both white and American Indian ancestry, like Charles Trimble, were the largest group of multiracial residents. This statistical finding of millions of multiracial people obscures how individuals are often asked to handle their identity. I'm going to circle the word obscures. And if I use context clues, the statistical finding of millions of multiracial people blank how individuals are often asked to handle their identity, I could use the word complicates as a synonym. For example, the enrollment forms for government programs typically include only a few broad racial ethnic categories. This approach to racial categorization is part of a long history that dictates single race identities. Still, many individuals, especially young adults, struggle against social pressure to choose a single identity and instead openly embrace multiple heritages. Public figures, rather than hide their mixed ancestry, now flaunt it. Singer Mariah Carey celebrates her Irish-American background, and President Barack Obama speaks of being born in Hawaii to a Kenyan father and a white mother from Kansas. So those would be examples of what they're talking about. Of choosing a single identity and having